That's it, ready to go on, because we have yet more powerful intellectual cocktails for you. I would like now to call upon Charles Gave to come to the podium. Charles is a French entrepreneur, financier and economist, a liberal conservative, the founder, director of Gavekal, and president of the excellent think tank, l'Institut des Libertés. He's going to talk to us about, as we say, the folding stuff, the dollar.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. As soon as freedom is mentioned, I feel like I have to come, but that's, you know what Churchill used to say, is that if you're invited to make a speech, you basically stand up to be seen, you speak loudly to be heard, and you sit down quickly to be re-invited. So I will try to be short. Okay, let's imagine for a second that you go to sleep in 1790, and like Rip and Winkle, you get up in 1830. You understand nothing. The world has changed beyond recognition. Then you go to sleep in 1890, you get up in 1930, and you understand nothing. The world has changed beyond recognition. Now go to sleep in 1990, and when you wake up in 2030, you will understand nothing. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the post-World War II order is breaking down, and that we are seeing the end of basically a world organized by the US. So I will present my case relatively simply. The case was based on a very simple control of the US, of the dollar, to buy energy. You know that the economy is nothing but energy transformed, and energy from 1945 to roughly 2 years ago was payable only in US dollars. So if the Americans didn't want you to buy energy, they simply cut the dollar from you and you were stuffed. There was nothing you could do. And the poor guys that tried to sell their oil in something else than the dollar, like Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi, had a very short life expectancy just afterwards. You see, I mean, there are things that you should not do if you're dealing with a big guy. Except that this time, to a certain extent, something happened, is that the biggest producer of energy and raw material for the next 20 or 30 years is going to be Russia. And Russia has also a very educated class, very good engineers. And so it was probable that within 20 or 30 years, Russia was going to emerge as a massive, massive power, with at the same time resources, knowledge, and linking all the Asian bloc. So, I'm not surprised, Russia started to have problems with Ukraine in 2014, the Maidan coup. And then, because Russia was selling a lot of our oil to Europe in euro, which, as I said, was a cardinal sin. So suddenly Russia had a lot of problems, which is going to surprise nobody, I suspect, but the most naive. So the war started in Ukraine, and we basically did two very intelligent things. First, we in Europe decided that we did not want the Russian energy anymore, which was extremely smart, because it almost guaranteed that we were going to take a 25% decline in our standard of living over time, but not in the standard of living of the guys that are in Brussels. I mean, the guys that are in that room, so they don't matter. So, and the second thing that was totally obvious is that Russia, if they could not sell their oil and gas to Europe, would have to sell it to somebody else. So they immediately turned east and started to sell like crazy in yuan to the Chinese. So that was the first major break. And then everybody told me Russia is going to become a colony of China, except that the Russians are kind of smart. And they immediately started to discuss with India in particular to open a north-south corridor that would go from Crimea to Bombay through all the Middle East, and that would lead to all the raw materials produced in Northern Asia to be able for the first time to reach India and be paid in rupee. So what it means is that it will absolutely guarantee that the center of the world growth for the next 20 years is going to be the Indian Ocean. That's where everything is going to take place. That's absolutely certain. But having been cut from the Russian energy, it means that Europe has managed to cut itself from this extraordinary growth. Doesn't mean that European companies will not participate, because we have some very good companies that will be able to participate, but the European consumer will not. That's totally impossible. So now we have that enormous growth coming, and we are finding ourselves with a very interesting question. For the first time ever, I think it was last week or the week before last, China exported its oil to Saudi Arabia. Sorry, imported its oil from Saudi Arabia and payable in renminbi. So to imagine that a state which was as domesticated by the US as the Saudis could suddenly decide to drop the dollar, you don't imagine what it means in diplomatic terms. It's a change in the life environment. So now, what is happening in the world today? It's pretty simple. Every country had to have a current account surplus with the US, earning dollars, depositing these dollars at the Fed, and with that you were buying US treasuries, and they needed dollars to buy their energy. So as WFI said 50 years ago, was a great French economist, he said, the privilege, imperial privilege that the US has is that the current account deficit financed the budget deficit, which was an extraordinary construction. And it has been lasting, which means that today we have something like, I don't know, the numbers are becoming so big that I have a hard time understanding them, but let's say 30 trillion of foreign exchange reserves that are in dollars in all the central banks of the world that they have accumulated by living below their means in order to be able to earn dollars versus the US. So they were all very happy to have these massive savings. And these are not needed anymore because all these countries can now buy their oil in their own currency. So you have $30 trillion in excess money. What will happen to this? I haven't got a clue. But it reminds me of what was called the balance sterling in the 50s, when suddenly it was discovered that Kuwait and all these guys had received sterling in payment for their oil at the time. And they didn't know what to do with the trade, with their excess reserves. So the first problem is that you have these massive reserves that are there. The second, that imagine for a second that I'm right, which has happened once or twice, but not too often. But let's imagine that I'm right, that the Indian Ocean is becoming the center of the world growth. The return on invested capital in the Indian Ocean, on all these countries, from India to Philippines to the Middle East, everywhere, is going to go up a lot, because you will have the networking of that part of the world, massive construction of airports, like a bit in China, but not inside the country, but inside an area. So you have a massive build-up, which implies a massive rise in real rates. Because, hey, you need to pay for these things. And it's very profitable, so people will learn to build roads everywhere in Central Asia, everywhere, and in the Indian Ocean. So fine. But you see, today, the real rates in the US on 3-month treasury bills are around 0%. And the servicing of the debt of the US, the servicing simply not repaying the debt, just paying the interest on the current debt, has just passed $1 trillion, I think. And you have only 3 big expenditures in the budget that can be cut in the US. The first one is Social Security. Second one is defense. And the third one is interest rates, if the central banks put interest rates at 0, as they did for quite a while. But if they put interest rates at 0, all these guys that have $30 trillion will dump the dollar, and the dollar will absolutely collapse. So they have a hard time doing it. If they maintain the interest rates at 5, then within 3-4 years, the servicing of the debt will be $2 trillion. And you know how much today the US budget deficit in the US is 7 or 8% of the GDP at the peak of the economic growth. So they have a 7% deficit where they've been growing for the last 5 years, when they should have a surplus right now. It would need 65% of the world's savings to go to the US to finance the US budget deficit. Give me a break, it will not happen. So if it doesn't happen, what will happen is that the US will have to cut their spending. Will they cut Social Security and be reelected? No, you don't believe it, huh? Neither do I. Will they cut the servicing of the debt? Well, if they cut interest rates too much, nobody will want their dollar, so it's difficult. So what will they cut? Defense. Okay? And the Finns have a very nice proverb which says that you always have an army in a country. If it is not the army of the country, it's the army of the country next door. See, and the poor guys said no, because they had the Swedes on one side. The Swedes today are okay, but in the 17th, 18th centuries, they were nothing but okay. They were pretty violent. So, and on the right, they had Russia. So the European army for the last 50 years has been the European army. The US army was the European army. Imagine for a second that they decide to do us in Afghanistan, to pack up and go to the US. They will probably keep something in the UK because they kind of like them. But maybe a little bit in Poland because it's close enough to Russia. But the rest. So who is going to be the European army? We have no kids. The demography in Europe is terrifying. The population in Italy, in Germany, in Spain will go down by 50% in absolute terms in the next 40 years. 50%, half, because of the collapse in demography. The women have a fertility rate of 1.2 child per woman. They hardly replace themselves, let alone the men. So we have no kids, we have no money, we have no army left. So the question that you should all be asking yourself is, who is going to be the European army taking care of us? If I look around, I'm just saying, look, you have two that could volunteer. The first one is the Russian army, first choice. And the second one is the Turkish army. So if maybe the Germans will prefer the Turks, the French, the Russians, I don't know. The French have still a little bit of the rest of an army, the Brits too. So in a perfect world, the French would get the hell out of Europe, do a Frexit, and try to merge their two armies with the UK in order to offer that as an alternative to the Russian and the Turkish army. But you wouldn't expect the politicians to be intelligent, would you? So you will never get that. So the point I'm trying to make, and I'm going to conclude here, is very simple, is the order that you thought was going to stay is going to explode we're all thinking that Europe is terrible, Brussels is this, Brussels is that. In 20 years, you will have no Brussels. What we have to do is get prepared for a chaotic world and rebuild our freedom at the bottom. Because nothing will come from the top, and the good news is that these terrible tops that we have had for the last 50 years are going to disappear. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that sobering speech, I think we can say. But we will be able to say in future that we heard what was going to happen here today.